There's a particular kind of quiet that settles over a man when he finally understands what's been done to him. Not anger, not grief. Something colder than both of those. Something that doesn't shake or pace or reach the phone to call someone who can't help anyway. It just sits down. It looks at the facts. And it begins to work. I want you to understand that about me before I tell you anything else. Because if you don't understand that first, the rest of the story is going to look like something it isn't. My name is Gerald Morrow. I am 64 years old. I live in Columbus, Ohio, and I have lived here for 31 years, in the same house on the same street, with the same 2 oak trees in the front yard that I have trimmed every October since 1993. I am a retired systems engineer. I spent 26 years with a federal contractor designing data infrastructure for facilities I am still not entirely at liberty to name, and I retired at 61 with a pension, a 2009 Ford F-150 with 114,000 miles on it. That runs better than most vehicles half its age, and what I believe at the time was a good marriage. I mention the truck because it matters later. I mention the data infrastructure because it matters sooner than that. Welcome to Dad's Raw Revenge. Go ahead and get comfortable, because this one is going to take you somewhere. Drop a comment, and let me know where you're watching from. Hit that like button. Make sure you're subscribed. Trust me, you're going to want to be here for this. My wife's name is Darlene. We met in 1987 at a company picnic. Her firm and mine, joint summer event, bad catering, good weather. She was 29. I was 27. She laughed at something I said about the potato salad, which I had identified as containing roughly twice the mustard necessary for any reasonable culinary purpose, and I thought, well, that is the woman I am going to marry. And I was right, which at the time felt like the best kind of good fortune. We have 2 sons. Marcus, the older one, lives in Charlotte with his wife and 2 daughters. Devin, the younger one, lives in Columbus about 4 miles from me, and we have coffee most Saturday mornings and talk about football and home repairing occasionally. Now, about what happened. Both of them are good men. Both were entirely unaware of what their mother had been doing for the better part of 2 years. I want to be honest about the kind of husband I was, because this kind of story has a way of flattening the man, telling it into something he isn't. I was not a saint. I worked long hours for most of our marriage. I traveled more than I should have during the years the boys were young. There were stretches. Devin was maybe 3, Marcus 7, when I was present in the house, but not always present in the room. If you understand what I mean. Darlene carried a significant load during those years, and I knew it, and I said so, and I tried to do better, with varying degrees of success over the following decade and a half. By the time I retired in 2019, I thought we had found our way to something solid. The boys were grown and settled. The house was paid off. I had time for the first time in decades, real time, unhurried time, and I had put some into the marriage the way I should have put it in 20 years earlier. We traveled. We took a cruise to Alaska in the spring of 2021. 12 days, inside passage, the kind of trip you read about and then put off for 30 years and then finally go on and wonder why you waited. Darlene said it was the best trip of her life. She said it standing on the deck, watching a glacier the size of a small city, and she said it again on the plane home, and I believed her both times. We had talked about buying a small place, somewhere warmer for the winters. I had looked at listings in Tucson and Savannah with the casual browser's lack of real commitment, but the conversations about it were real enough. We talked about it the way people talk about things they actually intend to do, not the way people talk about things they are only performing intent about. I believe we were building towards something. I mentioned this not to tell you what I felt when I found out what had been happening. I am not here to narrate my feelings. I mention it because it matters to the story that I was not a man who had already emotionally departed from his marriage and was simply waiting for paperwork. I was not watching for an exit. I was, to the best of my knowledge and belief, in a real marriage, living in a real house, making real plans. Right up until the Tuesday, I clicked on the 3rd tab of a storage management page and saw something that changed the shape of everything that had come before it. We had 4 devices in the house. My laptop, a ThinkPad I had used since 2019 and kept in reasonable order. Her laptop, a newer MacBook she had gotten in 2021. A shared tablet we kept on the kitchen counter. mostly for recipes and the weather and the occasional crossword puzzle on Sunday mornings. And her phone, which was her business. I never went through her phone, never had reason to, never wanted to be the kind of man who checked his wife's messages and called it love. I am still not that kind of man. I want to be clear about that. What I did do in April 2022 was set up an automatic cloud backup for all 4 devices. Every night at 2 a.m., while we slept, the system ran silently and copied everything to an off-site server I managed in my old contractor account. I did it because my brother-in-law, Darlene's younger brother Paul, had lost 3 years of family photos when his laptop died the previous fall. Hard drive failure, no backup, no recovery. I watched him sit at Thanksgiving and scroll through what he still had on his phone, trying to piece together what was gone, and I thought, that is not going to happen to us. I did not tell Darlene. I had set it up, not because I was suspicious, not because I was planning for anything. I did not tell her for the same reason. I do not narrate every systems decision I make about the house. I installed a carbon monoxide detector in the hallway in 2019 and did not hold a press conference about it either. I am a man who builds infrastructure and then forgets about it until it is needed. That is not a personality flaw. It is, as it turned out, the single most consequential habit of my adult life. That is what I want you to hold on to as I tell you what happened next. Everything that followed began with the same instinct I apply to carbon monoxide detectors and spare keys and second copies of important documents. The instinct that says, make it once, make it right, and trust that you will know what it was for when the time comes. The first hint that something was wrong came on a Tuesday evening in late March of 2023. I had driven over to Devin's house around 6:15 to drop off a set of socket wrenches I had borrowed the previous weekend for a brake job on the F-150. Simple errand, 10 minutes. Devin's truck was in the driveway when I pulled up, but so was another car I didn't recognize. A black Audi A6, relatively new, parked neatly along the curb. I didn't think much of it. I left the wrenches on the front step with a note and drove home. I mentioned it to Darlene when I got back. Offhand, no particular weight to it. She was at the kitchen counter with a glass of wine and a crossword she had been working on since before dinner. I said Devin had company. Left the wrenches on the porch. She didn't look up from the crossword. She said, "Oh, that's probably just Gary." I said, "Who's Gary?" She said, "A friend of his from work," and wrote something in a box on the crossword and moved on. I went to wash my hands. I made coffee I didn't need. I drank about half of it standing at the counter and poured the rest out. She had said his name too quickly. That was the thing I registered. Not accusingly. I want to be honest about this. I was not in accusation mode. I was not assembling a case. But the way you register something that is slightly off rhythm, a note that doesn't quite resolve. She did not pause and search the name the way you do when you are pulling up a detail about someone you have mentioned casually once or twice. She said it the way you say something you have been waiting to say. Ready, rehearsed. I filed it somewhere below the surface and went to watch the news. April was quiet. May was quiet. We drove to Charlotte for Memorial Day weekend, and I grilled chicken and played cornhole with Marcus's girls and thought with full sincerity that this was a good life. In June, Devin called me on a Wednesday morning at 8:47. He wanted to know if I'd come for dinner that Saturday. I said sure. Then there was a pause, and Devin does not pause. Devin is direct. He says what he means and then stops talking, which is a quality I tried deliberately to install in him and am proud to have succeeded at. And he said, "Dad, is everything okay?" "At home. I mean, with you and Mom." I said, "As far as I know." "Why?" He said, "No reason. Never mind. Saturday works." I said yes. We hung up. I stacked that next to the March note and looked at the two of them together, and I still did not have a case. I had a note and a pause. That is not a case. That is an old man talking himself into something, and I have no patience for old men who talk themselves into things. I went back to work. The following Tuesday, June 27th, 2023, 11:14 in the morning, I was at the kitchen table with my laptop, working through a consulting document for a former colleague who runs a small infrastructure firm and occasionally brings me in to review proposals. Darlene was out. She had told me she was going to the grocery store, and then to her friend Paula's for the afternoon. I was not looking for anything. I want to say that clearly. I was reading a procurement analysis and drinking coffee and listening to the neighborhood through the open kitchen window. The Hendersons' dog 2 doors down, a lawnmower somewhere on the next block, when my laptop flagged a storage notification. My cloud plan had exceeded its tier limit and was prompting me to upgrade. I clicked through to the storage management page. The backup activity log was a 3rd tab. I had not looked at it since I set the system up 14 months earlier. The log broke down file activity by device. My laptop showed steady, predictable usage. The tablet showed minimal activity, mostly read-only. Her laptop showed something different. There was a pattern of file deletions, not the ordinary housekeeping kind. Not someone clearing out old email attachments and forgotten downloads, but systematic, structured, folders cleared in sequence. New folders created under different names. Those folders cleared in turn. The pattern had been running, with varying intensity, for approximately 6 months. I am a systems man. I know what that pattern means. It means someone who knows enough to delete things, but does not know that deletion does not erase what has already been backed up to an offsite server. I sat there with the screen in front of me and the coffee going cold at my elbow and the Henderson dog still making noise down the street, and something in me went very still, cold, absolute, like a room after the last sound has stopped and you realize there is no more sound coming. I did not open the backup files. I closed the laptop. I sat at the kitchen table and looked out at the oak trees for a long time. I let myself feel what needed to be felt for about 3 minutes. Then I made a decision, not an emotional decision, not a reactive one, a permanent one. I would not open those files alone. I would not go through them and then go to bed next to her that night, carrying whatever they contained without structure or counsel. I would not confront Darlene. I would not call Marcus or Devin. I would not do anything at all until I had spoken to a professional who could tell me exactly what I was dealing with and exactly what to do about it. I am a systems man. I do not debug a system while it is running in a production environment. You pull it aside. You examine it in a controlled space. You understand what you have before you touch anything. I want to tell you about the night that followed. July 8th, when I closed the laptop, and July 9th, when I woke up and started making calls. That night was the only time, across all of this, that I allowed myself to fully sit with what I was carrying. I got up at 4 a.m. because I could not sleep, and I went to the kitchen, and I stood at the counter, and I did not make coffee, and I looked out the window above the sink. The oak trees were dark. The street was empty. The house was quiet in the specific way that houses are quiet at 4 o'clock in the morning. Not peaceful, but suspended, like the whole structure is waiting to see what happens next. I stood there for a while. I thought about the company picnic in 1987. I thought about Devin at age 3, sitting on my shoulders at the Ohio State Fair, delirious with happiness over something I can no longer remember. I thought about the Alaska cruise, the glacier, the look on Darlene's face watching it. Then I thought about the margin note I had seen on the screen. 2 words, not yet. I let myself feel it for as long as it needed to be felt. Then I ran cold water over my wrist for about 30 seconds, which is something I have done since I was a young man when I need to return to myself from somewhere I have gone. It works. It has always worked. Then I sat down at the kitchen table with a yellow legal pad from the drawer, and I spent 45 minutes writing down every step I intended to take, in order with the reasoning for each one. I do this when I am preparing to build something. By the time I was finished, I had 2 pages of notes and a sequence I believed in and something that had settled back into its proper location inside me. Not peace, not closure, just the steadiness that comes from having a plan you trust. I went back to bed at 5:14 a.m. I lay in the dark next to my wife of 36 years and looked at the ceiling and did not reach for her and did not move away from her. I just lay there and listened to the house settle, and I waited for morning the way a man waits for a thing he has already decided he is ready for. On the evening of July 8th, after Darlene had gone to bed, I sat down at the kitchen table and opened a cloud backup archive for her device and spent nearly 4 hours going through it. I will not catalog everything I found. What I will tell you is what it amounted to. There were emails, a correspondence account I had never seen, created specifically for this purpose, going back to October 2022. The man's name was Gary Ellison. He was 51 years old. He worked in commercial real estate on the east side of Columbus, handled property transfers and investment structuring, and had at some point in the fall of 2022 begun a relationship with my wife that was both personal and, as I read through it, deliberately financial in its construction. There was a secondary savings account opened in Darlene's name alone at Columbus Metro Credit Union. I had not known this account existed. 11 transfers into it over 9 months, amounts ranging from $2,400 to $6,800, each drawn from accounts I had access to and monitored in the ordinary way, each time during periods when I was confirmed traveling or otherwise out of house for extended stretches. Total across 11 transfers, $43,700, not rounded numbers. Specific odd amounts, carefully sized to stay below thresholds that trigger automatic alerts. And there was a document, a draft and signed, titled with a date in March of 2023, that outlined an informal asset petition, a structure designed to move a significant portion of our marital assets into sole ownership accounts before any formal legal proceeding could be initiated. The document had margin comments suggesting it had been reviewed and revised. The final margin note, in what I recognized as Darlene's handwriting, said, "Not yet." I closed the laptop at 1:47 a.m. I sat in the kitchen in the dark. The tile floor I had laid myself in 2011, one weekend in September, Devin helping with the grout and complaining about his knees. The window above the sink where the oak trees were visible in the moonlight, leaves moving in whatever wind was passing through. I thought about a man named Thomas Gable, a federal investigator I had worked alongside briefly in 1998, who once told me over bad coffee in a government building in Alexandria, "The most dangerous thing you can do after you find the evidence is let the other side know you found it. Give nothing away. Move quietly. Let the system do the work." I went to sleep at 3:22 a.m. I spent 2 full days researching attorneys before I made a single call. I was not going to walk into this underprepared. I built a short list of 3 names from Bar Association records, case databases, and 1 referral from a retired colleague who had been through a difficult dissolution 8 years earlier. I read every available public record on all 3 and called the one I believed was best equipped for what I was bringing her. Her name was Sandra Okafor. She had been practicing family and civil litigation in Columbus for 19 years. Her office was on North High Street, 4th floor, a modest space with a framed Thurgood Marshall quote on the wall that I read on the way in. She was 52 years old, wore reading glasses on a chain, and had the manner of a person who has heard every version of a story and is waiting for the specific detail that makes yours different from the last one. I sat down across from her on July 11th at 2 p.m., with a 3-page printed summary I had written that morning at the kitchen table, and a flash drive containing the backup archive organized into 4 labeled folders. Folder 1, the email correspondence, sorted chronologically. Folder 2, the financial transfer records annotated with dates of my confirmed whereabouts on each transfer date. Folder 3, the account documentation for the Columbus Metro Credit Union account. Folder 4, the asset petition draft with margin notes preserved. She read the summary without expression. 3 pages. Each page turned with the same unhurried care. When she finished, she set it down and looked at me over her glasses. And this is all documented. I set the flash drive on the desk between us. She looked at it for a moment, a long moment. I did not fill the silence, and neither did she, which told me something useful about her. Then she said, "Mr. Morrow, I want you to understand something. If what you're describing is accurate and the documentation is as organized as the summary suggests, this is not just a divorce case." I said, "I know." She said, "Do you want to tell me what outcome you're looking for?" I said, "I want it done correctly." She nodded once. She called her paralegal in, Jason Pruitt, precise manner, legal pad already open, and asked him to open a file. She told me she needed 3 days to review everything and would call me Friday morning. I thanked her and walked out past the Thurgood Marshall quote and drove home in the F, 150 with the windows down, because it was July in Columbus, Darlene was in the kitchen when I got back. She asked where I'd been. I said I'd had coffee with a former colleague. She said, "Anyone I know?" I said no. She handed me a sandwich, turkey on wheat, the same sandwich she had made for me on 1,000 Tuesday afternoons. And I ate it at the counter, and we talked about whether we ought to have Devin and his girlfriend over for dinner soon. I said that sounded nice. The 2 weeks between my first appointment and the morning of the service were, on the surface, entirely ordinary. I was, if anything, more attentive than usual. I asked about her book club. I suggested a walk along the Scioto Trail on Saturday morning. We went. She carried her coffee and I carried mine, and we talked about the city's plans for a new bridge section and about Devin's girlfriend, and the walk was pleasant because I was not performing pleasantness. I was choosing not to detonate something before the conditions for detonating it were exactly right. I am not a dramatic man. The people who know me would tell you that without hesitation, and they would not necessarily mean it as a compliment. Drama is expensive. Drama tips your hand. Drama gives the other person time to prepare, time to contact their own attorney, and rearrange things and construct a story. I have watched men lose everything they were entitled to because they could not keep their faces neutral for 2 weeks. I have always found that to be a very avoidable tragedy. Sandra called Friday morning at 10:22. She said she had reviewed everything, and she wanted to bring in one additional person before we proceeded. Detective Raymond Cross, Columbus PD, Financial Crimes Unit. She said the account transfer pattern and the asset partition document together cross a line from civil territory into something that warranted a formal criminal look. She had worked with Cross before. She said he was thorough and unhurried and good at his job, and that I should let her make the introduction. I said that was fine. We met on Monday, July 17th, at Sandra's office, 9 a.m. Detective Cross arrived at 8:58. He was 58 years old, solidly built, a gray sport coat, and a yellow legal pad under one arm. He shook my hand without ceremony, said he appreciated me coming in, and sat down. Sandra handed him the flash drive and a timeline she had prepared over the weekend. He uncapped his pen, set the legal pad flat on the table, and began to read. 8 minutes. I counted, not because I was nervous, but because I count things. It is how I am built. During those 8 minutes, he made notations I could not read from across the table, turned back twice to check something against Sandra's timeline, wrote a longer note in the margin of something on page 3. He did not look up once. At 8 minutes and approximately 40 seconds, he set down his pen. He looked at me. He said, "Mr. Morrow, I want to ask you one question." "Go ahead." "Did you at any point have access to the account at Columbus Metro Credit Union?" "I did not know the account existed until 12 days ago." He held that for a moment. Then he picked up his phone and walked to the far side of the room, near the window, and made a call that lasted 4 minutes and 11 seconds. When he came back, he sat down and tore a sheet from the legal pad and slid it across to Sandra. She read it and nodded once. He looked at me. "I'd like you to keep everything the same at home. Routine stays exactly as it is. Can you do that?" "I've been doing it for 3 weeks already." He looked at me for one beat. "Right." He wrote one more note. He said he'd be in touch through Ms. Okafor, probably 10 to 14 days. I drove home and pulled into the driveway at 11:13 a.m. and sat in the truck for a few minutes, not because I needed to compose myself, but because I wanted to be certain the way a man is certain when he has checked his work 3 times, certain that I was not going to walk into that house and do anything that could not be undone. I was certain. I went inside. Darlene was making lunch. I washed my hands at the kitchen sink, and she asked about my morning, and I told her I'd run an errand, nothing interesting, and she handed me a bowl of soup, and we stood in the kitchen together and talked about Devin's girlfriend. I said that sounded nice. The 10 to 14 days became 11. Sandra called on the afternoon of July 28th at 4:15 p.m. The transfer pattern, the asset partition document, and the subpoenaed correspondence from the secondary email account together constitute sufficient basis to proceed on both tracks simultaneously. Civil divorce proceedings and a parallel criminal inquiry into the structuring and concealment of marital assets. Gary Ellison was named as a person of interest in the criminal inquiry by virtue of his documented role advising the transfer structure. Sandra told me what the next step looked like. I listened without interrupting. Then I said yes. On the morning of August 2nd, 2023, at 10:30 a.m., Darlene was served at our home on Elmwood Drive by a process server accompanied by Detective Cross and a second officer from the Financial Crimes Unit. I was not there. Sandra had advised me to be elsewhere, and I agreed with her reasoning entirely. I was in the parking lot of Panera on Henderson Road with a paper cup of coffee and a month-old civil engineering journal I had found in the truck's back seat. The coffee was decent. There was an article on soil displacement modeling that I found genuinely interesting and read twice while I waited. Sandra called at 11:47 a.m. She said it was done. Darlene had called an attorney within 20 minutes of being served. Sandra said we were prepared for that. I finished my coffee. I set the paper cup on the passenger seat and looked at the parking lot for a moment, and then looked at the engineering journal in my lap and thought about soil displacement and the way foundations behave under load. And then I put the truck in drive and pulled out onto Henderson Road and drove home. The house looked exactly the same from the outside. The 2 oak trees caught the morning light the way they always do in August. That flat golden light. That means summer is starting to think about leaving. I sat in the truck in the driveway for a few minutes. Not because I needed to, just because I wanted to. I went inside. The kitchen counter was clean. The coffee maker was off. The crossword from Sunday was still on the counter, half finished, the pen sitting in the fold of the newspaper where she always left it. Darlene was at the kitchen table. She had been crying. Her attorney had already advised her not to speak to me directly about any of it, and she didn't. She looked at me once, and then looked away. I went to the counter and made coffee and poured 2 cups and set one in front of her. Without saying anything, I took mine to the living room and turned on the television. There was a program about national parks. I watched it until the light outside shifted from morning to afternoon. I almost felt sorry for her. Almost. The divorce was finalized in January of 2024. Sandra Okafor is, as I can now say from direct experience, exceptional at her work. The asset division reflected a full forensic accounting of what had been moved, what had been concealed, and what my contributions to our marital estate had represented across 36 years. Sandra used the word comprehensive to describe the outcome. It was an accurate word. Gary Ellison did not face criminal charges in the end. The structural threshold for criminal prosecution is a high one, and the evidence sat just below it. But the civil exposure attached to his role was significant enough that his own attorney reached out to Sandra in October to discuss a resolution. That resolution was reached. I will leave the specifics of it there. Devin handled it about as well as a grown son can handle something like this. Marcus had a harder time at first. He called me twice in September, and the conversations were difficult. I said the same thing to both of them that I have said every time the subject has come up since. Their mother made choices. I made choices. The choices had consequences. That is all I have to say about it, and all I will ever say about it to either of them. I still live on Elmwood Drive. The house is quieter than it used to be, which is most things being what they are. I trimmed the oak trees last October. Same as always. The F-150 is at 121,000 miles now. I finally had the passenger side air conditioning fixed last spring, 3 years after I should have. But some repairs you keep putting off, and then you do them, and you wonder what you were waiting for. Devin comes for coffee on Saturday mornings, and sometimes we sit on the back porch and don't say much, and I think that is its own kind of conversation. I drove to Charlotte in April to see Marcus's girls, and the younger one, who is 7 now, showed me a drawing she had made of our house and the oak trees, and she had gotten the trees approximately right. I have been asked more than once whether I regret waiting, whether I should have said something sooner, acted on the too quick name, and Devin's pause on the phone, and the note I had filed somewhere below the surface. Whether the weeks I spent eating dinner and watching television and carrying everything I knew in a chest that showed nothing, whether that was some kind of cruelty. My answer is no. A patient man is not a passive man. A patient man is a man who has decided that the quality of what he builds matters more than how quickly he begins building. I waited because waiting was the correct tool for what I was building. You do not rush foundation work. You do not pour concrete when the conditions are wrong. You assess. You prepare. You move when the movement will hold. Darlene underestimated me. Gary Ellison underestimated me. They looked at a quiet man who drove an old truck and kept a tidy house and had, by most external measures, nothing particularly interesting going on. They saw a 64-year-old systems engineer reading a journal in a parking lot, and nothing worth their attention. I have been underestimated for most of my adult life. I have never once corrected the impression. It is, as I have always suspected it would be, among the most useful things about me. If you enjoyed this story, join our community by hitting that like button and subscribing for more real, raw, and family-centered stories. And as always, thank you for being a part of Dad's Raw Revenge. I will see you on the next one.